Greetings, I'm Andrew Bush, and I just want to add a few extra comments on peacemaking and nonviolent action to this week's study material. You'll be listening to an extensive interview with Dr. Mubarak Awad, who is just a famous nonviolent Palestinian activist. But I wanted to add a few more thoughts to this discussion, which I think will enrich your understanding of peacemaking and nonviolent action. Achieving peace and justice doesn't often happen easily, but achieving peace necessitates addressing the causes of the conflict and bringing them to people's attention. And a sustainable peace requires that injustices be corrected. To create a sense of peace in which the underlying causes of a conflict remain will just be a temporary solution. And so action is required to overcome intractable injustice that's deeply embedded in a society. For instance, if you look at these photos, did quiet, easy discussion overcome South African apartheid? No. It took massive global boycotts of South Africa for the apartheid regime there to end. Did simply being nice overcome segregation in the United States? No, it took intense demonstrations and action on many levels to pressure the government to establish laws that would end legal segregation. Did subservience and simply being a good servant end British colonialism in India? Obviously not. Look at the life of Mahatma Gandhi and the nonviolent direct actions which he led, which ultimately brought the British colonialism in India to an end. Achieving justice and peace requires at times radical action. Here's a quote by the African-American leader Martin Luther King, and this is from his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which I hope that you read. He said, "Freedom is never given voluntarily by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And then here's another quote from Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist African-American leader who wanted to abolish slavery in the United States. This is what he said: "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters." Well, does nonviolent action work to overcome injustice? Statistically, nonviolence has achieved more success in the 20th century than has violence. From 1972 to 2002, 67 authoritarian regimes were overthrown around the world, and 75% of those through nonviolent action. Even failed nonviolent action prepared the way for future success, whereas failed violent actions reduce the probability of success. And I think we could see here in Palestine, the intifadas were an action against Israeli occupation, but especially in the Second Intifada, these were characterized by a lot of action on the Palestinian side. And in the end, what was gained? Much was lost. Closures became more severe, restrictions became more intense on Palestinian movement within their own territory. So violent actions are a huge risk. They can set back a cause a long way. My family, here's a photograph I'd like you to look at. My family and I lived in the Philippines from 1987 to 1998. It was our home, we loved it. There was a dictator there, Ferdinand Marcos, who ruled over the Philippines with the United States' approval and blessing for a long period of time. And this finally came to an end in 1986 with what were called the People Power movement, in which millions of Filipinos took to the street to protest his continued dictatorial rule over the country. And ultimately, the army, instead of resisting this popular movement, joined it. And then the United States stepped in and told President Marcos, you got to leave, you got to step down, your time is over. This was one of the most famous exercises, successful exercises of nonviolent protest towards the end of the 20th century. In the 21st century, just recently in Burma or Myanmar, the military took over the government again, staged a coup, and is now ruling the country by authoritarian rule. I have a dear friend, Laseng Dengren, who's a lecturer in our courses, who has friends in this demonstration that you're looking at. And many people have already been killed. So far, these nonviolent direct actions have not been successful, but they've gained global attention. And so we see these efforts can have a tremendous effect. Martin Luther King, in his writings on nonviolence, gave 6 principles of nonviolent direct action. And I'd like to just read these and let's consider these together. First, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is active, nonviolent resistance to evil. And really, as followers of Jesus, our call is to resist evil in whatever form it takes. And indeed, it should be a way of life as it was with Jesus. The second principle is nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation. Where we allow hatred to rise up in our heart and we call people names and we call people racist things because they're our enemy, we're not fostering peace or justice, and we're undermining a future solution that will redeem and reconcile a broken relationship. So our goal is to win friendships and understanding, not destroy friendships and understanding as we work in a situation of conflict. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. This is his third principle. Nonviolence recognizes that evildoers are also victims. When people are caught in a system of becoming the oppressor, that damages their soul and disfigures them as a human being. If you look at photographs of white racists in the South, for instance, who yelled ugly things at Martin Luther King and nonviolent demonstrators during the 50s and 60s, and you look at their faces, contorted with rage and hatred, you see that was damaging them. and disfiguring them as a human being. And so we have to keep in mind that where injustice exists, the enemy is the injustice, not the people who are perpetrating the injustice. That's hard to do because, obviously the people who bring injustice to our doorsteps are other human beings. So it's very hard not for them to become entwined in our thinking of injustice and see them as evil themselves. But it's the system of injustice that we seek to overturn. And then number 4, nonviolence affirms that suffering can educate and transform. Nonviolence willingly accepts the consequences to its acts. In other words, the suffering that Martin Luther King is talking about here is the suffering of those people involved in nonviolent direct action. He was heavily criticized for allowing children to come out and demonstrate in Birmingham, Alabama, and be a part of these marches, which the police were resisting and putting down with really brutal force. And Martin Luther King was heavily criticized for putting children in harm's way. But his response to that was the disfigurement of racism. For them to protest the disfigurement of racism was more important. That they could stand up for their own human dignity was more important than simply quietly suffering from it. And many children and hundreds of other people were arrested and put in jail. And it shocked the nation to see this. It shocked America to see children being brutalized, young girls being attacked by police dogs. So suffering can educate. Nonviolence does not seek to avoid suffering. And number 5, nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. Nonviolence resists violence to the spirit as well as the body. Nonviolence does not sink to the level of the hater. Love restores community and resists injustice. Nonviolence recognizes the fact that all life is interrelated. And the way of love was the way Martin Luther King walked. He was, of course, a Christian minister, and his faith was rooted in the love of Jesus. His understanding of nonviolent action was rooted in the love of Jesus. When you listen to Mubarak Awad in his interview with the Washington Post, you'll sense great love. Even though Mubarak specifically attempted to keep his nonviolent action efforts secular, because he wanted to address all of society and didn't want to be placed into a niche of Christianity, since the majority of Palestinians are Muslim. I mean, Mubarak is a Christian himself, but he wanted to act from a secular perspective. But nevertheless, you sense in him, and he acknowledges how his faith kept him rooted in love. And that's what Christ calls us to. And finally, number 6, nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. The nonviolent resistor has deep faith that justice will eventually win. A famous quote of Martin Luther King was that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that's our hope. There are numbers of methods of nonviolent action. A very famous author and theorist of nonviolent action is Gene Sharp, and he wrote a classic 3-volume work called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And he lists 6 basic categories of nonviolent action. And these are nonviolent protest and persuasion, which I showed you pictures of. For example, the People Power movement in the Philippines. Social non-cooperation, just not participating in events and organizations that promote injustice. Economic non-cooperation or economic boycotts. Economic non-cooperation and in the form of strikes, where workers stay out of work, their places of employment, to protest unjust working conditions and policies. Political non-cooperation, and among the Amish and other Anabaptist groups in Pennsylvania, they have agreement with the U.S. government that they will not pay their taxes because the taxes support war, and so they write a document indicating that the money they give to the government is not to go to the military, etc. And then nonviolent intervention into a situation. And we can also classify these in two broad categories of obstructive or constructive programs of nonviolent action. Obstructive programs like protests, resistance, and interventions are best to confront direct violence, which builds a negative peace, which is just the absence of conflict, but seldom change the social and economic and cultural patterns of society, which is necessary to establish a positive peace. On the other hand, constructive programs seek to alter social, economic, and cultural patterns and build a positive peace, build institutions and structures in society that will sustain a durable peace. But implementation of this takes much longer and much longer commitments and greater persistence. An important form of constructive programs is building alternative just societies, whether this is in associations or in local communities, but forming groups of people that show unjust society what a healthy, just society can look like. There's a greater possibility of success in nonviolent direct action if multiple sectors of society are involved in nonviolent action. And there's also a greater possibility of success if multiple methods of nonviolent action are used. For instance, people may bring to bear boycotts, but they also bring to bear protests and other writing, etc., other forms of nonviolent direct action. If people there's a greater possibility of success if people understand the principles of nonviolent action. If they don't really understand the principles, then there's a greater chance people will fall into the use of violence. And it's important to dispel the myths of nonviolent direct action. Some of these myths are that nonviolent action is passive, and some of the confusion on this point is that from Gandhi's term, passive resistance. That was his term for nonviolent direct action, passive resistance. And this can be confused with pacifism or quietism, in which people just do nothing. So that's an important clarification. Nonviolent action should not be equated with pacifism, or it's not simply passive. Nonviolent action does not work against authoritarian governments. This is a myth. It does work. I mean, I showed you in the Philippines how it worked. Another myth is that nonviolent campaigners seek to avoid conflict and that they're somehow weak or afraid, and that's not true at all. I mean, you look at nonviolent demonstrators who have been brutally resisted by authoritarian regimes, and yet they have had the courage to maintain their resistance. Look at Hong Kong in recent years in the protests against China's increasing exercise of authority over Hong Kong. And finally, another myth is that nonviolent action is inherently good. It isn't, because unjust governments have also used nonviolent action. For example, in Nazi Germany, the government staged a boycott and encouraged all of society to boycott Jewish shops as a form of boycott. And it was very painful, of course, to the Jewish people. So principles of nonviolent action can be used by the wrong actors. Just as we close, Palestinian nonviolent action has been courageous. Many have lost their lives in nonviolent protests, and it's taken many forms. One form of economic boycott is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, or BDS, which encourages people around the world to boycott Israeli products, to divest investments from companies that are actively involved in the occupation, and encourage governments to issue sanctions against Israel for its unjust action. Palestinians, of course, have exercised nonviolent demonstrations, art projects, writings, resistance to land confiscation, and have worked to create a viable alternative society that can show the world that the Palestinian state can be viable and alive and vigorous. So I think you'll enjoy that last photograph I have of some nonviolent Palestinian protesters dressed up as some type of movie characters, but good sense of humor. Finally, just as we close, simple steps to take in one's everyday life in terms of promoting justice are to avoid products that are produced through exploitation or on property that's unjustly gained, to avoid making money from the sale of products in the occupied territory or that would benefit an authoritarian regime, and to oppose politically unnecessary war, the sale of arms, etc. 20 years the United States was in Afghanistan. More than 2,000 U.S. soldiers' lives were lost in that war. And in virtually one day, all that 20 years disappeared yesterday. And the Taliban movement has retaken all of Afghanistan. The Afghan government has fallen, and a new Taliban regime is about to be installed. And yet, when we go back and look at the beginning of that war, which followed the bombings on 9/11 in the United States, there were only 1 or 2 senators who opposed that war. And anyone who opposed it was just regarded as a freak, because it was unpatriotic, because that war was acting against those who bombed the Twin Towers in New York City on 9/11. Only 2 senators opposed it. And now we look back, and what was the purpose of that war? All those who voted for that war, the end result of that was 2,000 American soldiers killed, more Allied troops killed as well. How many Afghans were killed? And in the end, we're back to square one. Could there have been a better solution from the start? I think you can argue there could have been. So I hope this brief discussion has been helpful, and I encourage you as you go forward to make nonviolence and resistance of evil part of your lifestyle. Thanks.